Rain hammered the stable roof the night Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Larchgate, pulled a borrowed coat over his shoulders and walked into his own stables as a stranger. He had told no one his plan, not his steward, not his valet, not even his closest friend. He had simply vanished from his own house for 3 days, cut his hair shorter than any duke would dare, and returned through the servants' gate wearing the plain wool of a groom. To the world, he was Nathaniel Vane. To the household staff who did not know his face well enough to question it, he was simply Nate, a groom hired on short notice for the house party. It was a foolish plan, he knew that, but he was done being foolish in the other direction, done watching women flutter their fans and laugh too loudly at his jokes because he held a title. He wanted to know, once and clearly, whether a woman could be kind without an audience worth impressing. He wanted to watch how his guests treated the people who could do nothing for them. A duke sees flattery every day. He rarely sees truth. The house party had been his mother's idea, though she believed him occupied with estate matters in the north. 20 guests, all daughters of good families, all paraded before him at breakfast and cards and evening music, every one of them polished until she gleamed like silver. He hated silver. He wanted to see rust, the honest kind, the kind that showed a person had been left out in the weather and had not pretended otherwise. He took his place in the stable that first night, learning where the tack hung, which horse bit and which did not, how the head groom liked his hay stacked. The head groom, a broad man named Elias Marsh, eyed him with the particular suspicion of a man who had trained every hand for 10 years and did not appreciate a new one appearing without warning. "You've held reins before," Elias said, watching him settle a nervous mare. "A little," Nathaniel answered, keeping his voice low and even, stripped of the cadence that marked him as a man raised to command rooms. "Good. We've 20 guests and their horses tomorrow, and half of them will not know a bridle from a bootlace," Elias spat into the straw. "Fine folk. Fine until it rains on their boots." Nathaniel said nothing, but he filed the comment away. Elias Marsh, it seemed, had already formed his opinion of fine folk, and Nathaniel suspected it had been earned honestly. The carriages began arriving the next afternoon, one after another, wheels churning the gravel drive into mud. Nathaniel worked at the edge of the yard, taking horses by the bridle, leading them to water, checking their shoes for stones. He watched the guests descend from their carriages in silks and traveling cloaks, watched them glance at the grooms the way one glances at furniture, useful and unremarkable. A young woman named Miss Verity Coles stepped down and handed her reins to Nathaniel without looking at him, already calling over her shoulder to her mother about the state of the roads. Lord Pelham's daughter did not even release the reins properly, simply dropped them and let Nathaniel catch the leather before the horse startled. He said nothing. This was, after all, precisely the behavior he had come to observe. It was late in the afternoon, when the light had turned the color of weak tea, that the last carriage rolled up the drive. It was smaller than the others, drawn by a single tired bay, and it rattled rather than glided. A woman climbed down before the footman could properly assist her, catching her own skirt in one hand and thanking the boy who held the door with a warmth that made him blink in surprise. She turned toward the stable yard, leading her own horse, rather than waiting for someone else to do it, and Nathaniel found himself watching her with more attention than the moment strictly required. "Good afternoon," she said to him, and stopped. Actually stopped, the way no other guest had that day, and looked at him as though he were a person rather than a fixture of the yard. "I am sorry. He does not like strangers much. His name is Bracken. He was my father's, before." "He'll settle," Nathaniel said. "Horses generally do, once they know a place is safe." "I hope so. He has had a hard journey." She smiled, and there was nothing performed about it, nothing calculating, in the way her eyes moved over his plain coat and dirt-marked boots. "What is your name?" No one else had asked, not one of the 19 guests who had arrived before her. "Nate," he said, the lie coming easier than he expected. "Well, Nate, thank you for taking such good care of him. I am Clara Whitmore." She said it plainly, as if her name meant nothing more than any other name, though Nathaniel had heard whispers of the Whitmore family already that morning, whispered not with admiration but with a faint, unkind pity. A good family fallen on quiet times, someone had murmured over breakfast. Invited more from old friendship than present standing. Clara did not seem embarrassed by any of it. She simply patted Bracken's neck and murmured something to him that Nathaniel could not hear, and then followed the housekeeper inside, glancing back once to be certain the horse was settled before she went. Nathaniel led Bracken into a stall and found himself standing there a moment longer than the task required, turning over the strange fact that a woman with every reason to guard her own dignity carefully had spent none of it worrying whether a groom thought well of her. She had simply been decent, the way some people are decent without calculation, the way water finds the lowest point without deciding to. He told himself it meant little. One kind word from one weary traveler proved nothing about a person's character. He had learned, in 29 years of being a duke, that first impressions were often manufactured, that people could perform warmth as easily as they performed wit. He would watch her. He would watch all of them. That was the entire purpose of the disguise, and he would not let one soft moment in a stable yard undo his resolve to see clearly. Still, that evening, as he mucked out stalls by lantern light while the great house blazed with candles and laughter above him, he found his thoughts returning to the way she had said his false name, as though it belonged to someone worth remembering. The house party's first proper evening began with a dinner Nathaniel could hear faintly from the stable yard, the murmur of conversation, and the occasional ripple of laughter drifting across the lawn. He was not troubled by his absence from his own table. His steward would tell any who asked that the Duke had been delayed by business and would join the party within the week, a lie constructed carefully enough to survive a few days of scrutiny. He spent that first night listening more than working, learning the rhythms of a stable yard he had never truly seen before, despite it standing on his own land since before his birth. He learned which grooms complained and which worked without a word, learned that Elias Marsh, gruff as he was, left out a plate of bread and cheese for any hand who worked past dark, quietly, without announcement, so that no one would feel they were receiving charity. It struck Nathaniel that he had walked past men like Elias Marsh his entire life without truly seeing them, the way a man walks past a wall he has always known would hold him up. He had inherited kindness as an abstraction, something he believed himself to possess because he did not actively cause harm. He was beginning to suspect that kindness required more than absence of cruelty. It required attention. It required noticing. The next morning brought a ride, the whole party mounting up for a tour of the grounds while the grooms stood ready with fresh horses and spare tack in case of trouble. Nathaniel held Clara's stirrup as she mounted, and though it was his duty to do so for every rider, he noted that she thanked him for it, the same as she had thanked the housekeeper the evening before, the same simple courtesy extended without regard for whether it was noticed or returned. Beside her, another guest, a striking young woman named Miss Honoria Bell, swung into her saddle without a glance at the groom who assisted her, already speaking loudly to a gentleman nearby about the quality of the horses Larchgate kept, as though the animals existed for her assessment alone. Nathaniel had met Honoria before, at balls in town, where she had smiled at him with practiced brilliance the moment she learned his title. She did not recognize him now, of course. Grooms were beneath recognition. The riders set off across the meadow, and Nathaniel watched them go, 20 bright figures against the green, and found his eyes settling, without quite meaning them to, on the smaller figure riding near the back, sitting her horse with quiet competence, in no hurry to catch the others, content simply to be out in the morning air. He did not yet know what he was building toward. He knew only that something in him had shifted since the carriage wheels first churned that mud, and that he intended to keep watching, carefully, honestly, to see whether the shift was warranted, or whether he was, after all these years of caution, finally allowing himself to be fooled. By midday the riders returned, horses damp with sweat, laughter carrying across the yard as grooms hurried forward to catch reins and lead the animals to water. Nathaniel took Bracken's lead from Clara's hands and noticed, again, the small things that others overlooked. She dismounted without waiting for assistance, careful not to land wrong and startle the horse. She ran a bare hand along his neck before she released him to Nathaniel's care, murmuring a word of thanks to the animal, as though he could understand her. "He did well today," she said to Nathaniel. "Better than I hoped, given how tired he was last night." "He has a steady rider," Nathaniel answered. "Horses know the difference." Clara's cheeks colored faintly at the compliment, though it had been offered plainly, without flattery in mind. "That is kind of you to say. Most people only notice the horse when something goes wrong." "Most people notice a great many things only when they go wrong," Nathaniel said, and regretted the words the moment they left him, too knowing for a groom, too weighted with a duke's private cynicism. But Clara only nodded, as though the observation matched something she already believed, and led herself toward the house without further comment. Nathaniel stood in the yard a moment longer, Bracken's reins still warm in his hand, and allowed himself, just once, the dangerous thought that perhaps this house party would not end the way he had expected when he first put on the borrowed coat. Elias Marsh appeared beside him, wiping his hands on a rag, following Nathaniel's gaze toward the house. "That one," the head groom said, nodding after Clara, "always speaks to the hands like they've got names worth using." Rare thing, in this crowd. You've noticed that, Nathaniel said. I notice most things. In my own yard. Elias gave him a long look, the kind that made Nathaniel wonder, briefly, whether the man suspected more than he let on. But Elias only clapped him once on the shoulder and turned back to his work, leaving Nathaniel alone with the reins, the quiet yard, and a resolve that had, without his quite permitting it, grown a good deal more personal than he had planned. By the third day, Nathaniel had learned the rhythm of Clara Whitmore's mornings, though he told himself he was not counting the hours until she appeared at the stable door with a heel of bread saved from breakfast for Bracken. She came every day at the same time, before the rest of the party had finished dressing, and she always spoke to him as though their conversation from the day before had simply paused rather than ended. It was a small thing, but Nathaniel had begun to understand that small things were exactly what he had come to observe. Grand gestures could be performed for an audience. A private habit, repeated without witness, could not. You favor your left hand, she said one morning, watching him buckle a girth strap. I noticed yesterday too. An old injury, Nathaniel said, which was true enough, though the injury had come from a hunting fall 3 years past and not from the labor a groom might expect. It aches when the weather turns. Then you should rest it when you can. She said this simply, without the performance of concern he had seen other women use to draw attention to their own tender hearts. She was not asking to be praised for noticing. She had simply noticed, and said so, and moved on to check Bracken's water trough herself, rather than leaving the task to him. He wanted to tell her that dukes did not rest an aching hand, that a man in his position could not simply set down his obligations because his body complained. But Nate the groom had no such obligations, and so he said only, I'll manage, and watched her nod, as though that answer satisfied her completely. That evening the house held its first proper entertainment, music and cards in the drawing room while the last light faded gold over the meadow. Nathaniel, still bound to the stable by his disguise, worked past dark checking the horses one final time, and found Elias Marsh waiting for him with 2 plates balanced on a barrel. Sit, Elias said. No sense working through supper. The horses will keep. Nathaniel sat, grateful for the excuse to rest his hand, and ate in the company of a man who had no idea he was sharing bread with the Duke who owned every beam over their heads. It was, he thought, one of the more honest meals he had eaten in years. You're quiet for a new hand, Elias observed, chewing. Most men talk more, trying to prove themselves worth their wages. I've little to prove, Nathaniel said, which was truer than Elias could have guessed. Fair enough. Watch the Whitmore girl, if you want to see how it's done proper. She thanked me for shoeing her father's horse 2 years back, sent a note besides, when the family still had coin to spare for such things. Family's fallen on leaner days now, from what I hear, but she hasn't changed a hair. Some do, when the money goes. She didn't. Nathaniel turned this over carefully. A note of thanks, sent 2 years past, before hardship had given her any reason to court favor with a groom who could offer her nothing in return. It was not proof of a saint. It was simply consistent with everything he had observed since her carriage first rattled up the drive. And the others? He asked, careful to keep his tone idle. The rest of the party? Elias snorted. Fine feathers, most of them. Miss Bell dropped her whip in the mud yesterday and near boxed young Tam's ears for not catching it fast enough, though it fell from her own careless hand. Lord Pelham's daughter won't look a groom in the face if she can help it, like we're something that might catch on her skirt. He shook his head. Not every guest is cut from that cloth, mind. But you'll find the Whitmore girl is rarer than most. Rarer than most. Nathaniel carried the phrase with him as he finished his bread, and found it settling somewhere he had not expected, somewhere beneath the careful, cynical calculation that had brought him into this disguise in the first place. The days that followed brought small tests, though Nathaniel had not designed them as such. A sudden rain caught the riding party a mile from the house, and while most guests complained loudly of ruined boots and demanded the groom's hurry, Clara had dismounted to walk beside Bracken over a patch of uneven ground, sparing the horse the strain of her weight on the slick stone, arriving back soaked and laughing rather than sour. You'll take a chill, Nathaniel warned, taking Bracken's reins as she led him into the dry stable. I've taken worse for less reason, she said, wringing water from her sleeve with cheerful resignation. Bracken did not ask for this rain. It seemed unfair to make him suffer the hill as well as the water. It was a small kindness, offered to an animal who could not thank her for it, in front of an audience who might have judged her muddied hem rather than admired her reasoning. Nathaniel found himself smiling before he remembered to guard his expression, and Clara caught it, tilting her head with curious amusement. You find that foolish, she said. I find it rare, he answered, echoing Elias without quite meaning to. She considered this, wringing out the last of her sleeve. I think people are often kinder to those who cannot ask it of them than to those who can. It costs nothing to be gentle with a horse. No one will accuse you of currying favor with an animal that has no vote in society. Her eyes flickered toward the house, toward the bright windows where the rest of the party had already gathered to dry themselves by the fire. It is harder, I find, to be gentle with people who might mistake it for weakness. Nathaniel wanted to ask what had taught her that particular lesson, wanted to know what unkindness she had weathered that made her speak with such quiet certainty about the cost of gentleness. But a groom did not ask a guest such personal questions, and so he held his tongue, filing the words away with everything else he had gathered about her. A growing collection he no longer pretended, even to himself, was purely for the sake of judgment. That night, unable to sleep in the narrow cot above the tack room, Nathaniel found himself standing at the small window, looking toward the house where a single candle still burned in an upper room. He did not know which window belonged to Clara Whitmore. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself, too, that a duke conducting an honest test of character ought not to feel his chest tighten at the memory of a woman wringing rainwater from her sleeve and laughing as though the world had not given her ample reason to stop laughing months ago. He thought of Elias's words again, rarer than most. He thought of the note sent 2 years past, before hardship, when there had been nothing at all to gain from kindness toward a stable hand. He thought of her hand on Bracken's neck, murmuring comfort to a creature who could not repay her. A duke was supposed to remain apart from such thoughts, watching from a careful distance, gathering evidence like a magistrate weighing a case. But Nathaniel Vane, standing at a narrow window in borrowed clothes, found the distance had grown thinner than he intended, and he was no longer entirely certain he wished to reclaim it. Morning came gray and cool, the kind of morning that made a man grateful for work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. Nathaniel threw himself into the stable's routine with unusual energy, mucking stalls and mending tack, anything to keep from dwelling too long on a woman who was, in every practical sense, entirely beyond his reach while he wore a groom's coat, and perhaps beyond his reach in truth, once the disguise came off and she learned how thoroughly she had been deceived. He did not yet know how the deception would end. He knew only that it could not continue forever, and that each day it continued, the stakes of its ending grew a little higher. The afternoon brought a new arrival to the house party, a gentleman named Lord Percival Ashford, whose family holdings bordered Larchgate's eastern fields and whose reputation, Nathaniel recalled from town gossip, was built as much on his ambition as on his charm. Ashford arrived on a fine black gelding, handling the reins with careless confidence, and tossed them toward the nearest groom without breaking his stride toward the house. "See that he's cooled properly," Ashford said, not looking to see which hand caught the leather. "He's worth more than your yearly wage, so mind you don't ruin him." Nathaniel caught the reins without comment, though the insult, aimed carelessly at a man Ashford did not know was his host, struck with an odd, distant sting. He had been spoken to sharply before, by men who believed themselves his equals or betters, but never quite like this, never with the specific carelessness reserved for someone assumed incapable of taking offense. It was, he thought, an education in itself. Clara had been crossing the yard when Ashford spoke, and Nathaniel watched her pause, her expression flickering with something too brief to name before she smoothed it away. She said nothing in that moment, only continued toward the house. But later, when Nathaniel led the gelding past the kitchen garden where she sat with a book, she looked up and spoke without preamble. "Lord Ashford is not always so short with people," she said, as though she felt some obligation to soften what he had witnessed. "I think travel wears on his temper." "You need not excuse him to me," Nathaniel said. "I'm accustomed to it." "That does not mean you should be." Her voice held a firmness he had not heard from her before, quiet but certain. "Being accustomed to poor treatment is not the same as deserving it. I hope you know the difference." He did know the difference, though he had rarely heard it stated so plainly, and never by someone with no reason to say it except that she believed it true. He thanked her, briefly, and led the gelding on toward the stable, turning her words over with the same care he had given everything else she had said to him that week. That evening, watching from the shadow of the stable door as candlelight spilled from the drawing-room windows, Nathaniel saw Ashford make his way deliberately toward Clara, bowing over her hand with practiced elegance, and felt something tighten in his chest that he recognized, with some discomfort, as jealousy. It was an absurd feeling for a man in his position, watching a courtship he had no right to interrupt while dressed as a servant who could offer nothing to compete with a lord's attention. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself he had come to Larchgate's own stables to judge character. not to develop feelings that could lead nowhere so long as he remained hidden behind a false name. But the feeling did not leave him, and he found himself watching the lit windows longer than any sensible man would, waiting for a glimpse of a figure who did not know she was being watched, or why. The following days brought smaller moments that added, one by one, to the picture forming in Nathaniel's mind. He watched Clara share her seat at breakfast with a younger guest who had been left without a place at the crowded table, though the girl was a stranger to her and offered nothing in return but quiet gratitude. He watched her return a dropped glove to a housemaid who had not noticed its loss, offering it with the same courtesy she might extend to a duchess. He watched her sit with an elderly aunt of the household who had been largely ignored by the younger guests, listening to the woman's stories with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than dutiful patience. None of it was performed for an audience that mattered. The younger guest she helped had no influence to offer in return. The housemaid could not advance her standing in society. The elderly aunt held no sway over any match Clara might hope to make. And yet Clara extended the same warmth to each of them that she extended to Nathaniel himself, consistent in a way that no amount of calculation could sustain for so many days running. Elias Marsh, watching Nathaniel watch the house one evening, offered a dry observation that struck closer to the truth than the old groom could have known. "You've got the look of a man deciding something," he said, filling his pipe with unhurried care. "Careful what you decide, lad. Some decisions cost more than a groom's wages to walk back from." Nathaniel said nothing, but the words stayed with him long after Elias had wandered off toward his own quarters, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, how he would ever explain to Clara Whitmore the full weight of what he had decided, and whether she would forgive him the manner in which he had decided it. He walked the length of the stable one last time before turning in, checking each door was latched and each horse settled for the night. Bracken nickered softly as he passed, and Nathaniel paused to rest a hand against the animal's warm neck, thinking of the woman who had walked a muddy hill rather than let this creature bear her weight over slick stone. A duke was meant to weigh matches with careful reason, to consider land and lineage and the alliances a marriage might secure. Nathaniel had been raised on such reasoning since boyhood, had watched his own father choose a wife for the strength of her family's connections rather than the warmth of her heart, and had told himself, in his more private moments, that he would not make the same choice when his own time came. Yet he had never quite believed, until this week in a borrowed coat, that he might find a woman whose character held firm whether or not anyone of consequence was watching. He extinguished the lantern and climbed the narrow stair to his cot above the tack room, and lay awake a long while listening to the horses shift and settle below him, turning over the question of how many more days he could continue this deception, before it either revealed him or ruined something he had only just begun to understand he wanted to protect. The storm came without warning on the 6th night, rolling in off the western hills faster than the household had prepared for, and it caught half the guests still walking the garden paths when the first hard rain began to fall. Nathaniel was in the stable when the wind picked up, securing the loose shutter over the hayloft window before it could tear free, and it was through that half-open shutter that he saw a figure hurrying across the yard, skirts whipping, heading not toward the house but toward the stable itself. He climbed down in time to catch the door before it slammed shut behind Clara, soaked through, her hair come loose from its pins and plastered to her face, breathing hard from the run. "Bracken," she said, before Nathaniel could ask anything at all. "I heard the thunder starting and thought of him alone in his stall. He hates storms, he always has." "He'll be well enough," Nathaniel said, though he understood, even as he said it, that reassurance was not truly what had driven her out into the rain. She needed to see for herself, the same instinct that had made her walk a muddy hill rather than let the horse bear her weight. They found Bracken with his ears pinned back, shifting anxiously in his stall as thunder cracked somewhere close overhead, and Clara went to him at once, murmuring low words Nathaniel could not fully hear, running her hand along his neck in slow, steady strokes, until the animal's ears began to loosen, and his weight settled more evenly on all four legs. "You have a gift with him," Nathaniel said, watching from the stall door. "He is the last thing my father gave me before he died." Clara said it simply, without the weight of tragedy performed for sympathy, though the words themselves carried enough weight on their own. "I suppose I would learn to calm any creature, if calming him meant keeping some piece of my father close a little longer." Nathaniel had not known her father was gone. He had assumed, from the whispers about the family's fallen fortunes, some manner of financial ruin, debts, or bad investment, the ordinary misfortunes of a good family in lean years. He had not considered that the hardship might run deeper than money. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. It was 2 years ago now. She kept her hand moving along Bracken's neck, her eyes on the horse rather than on Nathaniel, as though the conversation were easier to have without the weight of his gaze. He left us little beyond this horse and the house itself, which we have managed to keep, though only just. My mother says we are invited to gatherings like this one, more from memory of old friendship than present regard. I think she is likely right, though it costs nothing to enjoy the invitations we still receive. The rain continued to hammer the roof above them, and Nathaniel found himself sitting on an overturned bucket near the stall door, in no hurry to end the conversation, despite the late hour and the impropriety of a groom sitting so easily in a guest's company. "Does it trouble you?" he asked, "knowing why you're invited?" Clara considered the question with more seriousness than he expected. It did, at first. "I used to watch the other girls at these gatherings and wonder what it would feel like to walk into a room without doing the arithmetic of who still valued my company and who merely tolerated it out of old habit. But I have found, since my father died, that worrying over such arithmetic wastes time I would rather spend on kinder things. I cannot control who values me. I can only control whether I am worth valuing." She glanced up at him then, a small, rueful smile touching her mouth. "That must sound very solemn, for a conversation in a stable during a storm." "It doesn't," Nathaniel said. "It sounds like the truest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I care to admit." Something shifted in her expression at that, a flicker of curiosity, as though she had caught, briefly, some note in his voice that did not quite match the coat he wore. But she did not press the observation, only turned back to Bracken as thunder rolled again, softer now, the storm beginning to pass over the hills toward the coast. "You speak carefully, for a groom," she said after a moment. "Elias barks his sentences like a man used to shouting over horses. You choose your words as though you were taught to." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He had not guarded himself as closely as he believed, and here, in the quiet dark of the stable with rain still dripping from the eaves, he felt the first real danger of discovery, not from a rival groom or a suspicious steward, but from the very woman he had least wanted to deceive. "My mother valued speech," he said carefully, which was true in its own strange way, though it revealed nothing of the truth she deserved. She believed a man's words were worth as much as his labor. "A wise woman," Clara said, and did not push further, though Nathaniel suspected, from the thoughtful way she studied him afterward, that the question had not entirely left her mind. They sat a while longer as the storm eased, talking of smaller things, of Bracken's temperament and the state of the garden paths, and 100 ordinary matters that meant nothing on their own but that, taken together, built something Nathaniel had not expected to build inside a stable with a woman who believed him a servant. She asked after his family, and he answered in careful half-truths, describing a household that existed somewhere between the truth of his childhood and the plausible fiction a groom might claim. She listened as though every word mattered, without once glancing toward the door as though eager to return to guests of greater consequence. It was well past midnight when the rain finally stopped, and Clara rose, brushing straw from her damp skirts, suddenly aware of the hour and the impropriety of having spent it in such company. "I should return before I am missed," she said, though her tone carried a note of genuine reluctance. "Thank you, Nate, for sitting with me. I know it was not required of you." "It was no trouble," Nathaniel said, and walked her to the stable door, watching her cross the wet yard toward the house, her figure growing smaller against the dark lawn, until the kitchen door swallowed her from sight. He stood in the doorway a long while after she had gone, listening to the last drops fall from the eaves, and found himself facing a truth he had been circling for days without quite naming it. He was no longer conducting a test. He was no longer a duke gathering evidence to confirm his cynicism about the women of his class. He had fallen, plainly and completely, for a woman who believed him a servant, and he did not know how many more days he could continue the deception before either love or honesty forced his hand. The next morning brought clear skies and a household busy repairing storm damage, fallen branches to clear from the drive, a shutter to mend, the ordinary aftermath of weather that had passed without serious harm. Nathaniel worked alongside Elias and the other hands, grateful for labor that occupied his body while his mind continued turning over the conversation in the stable, the grief in Clara's voice when she spoke of her father, the quiet dignity with which she had described her family's fallen circumstances. He thought, too, of her observation about his speech, the way she had caught something in him that did not fit the coat he wore. He would need to be more careful, he told himself, though even as he thought it, some quieter part of him wondered whether careful concealment was truly what he wanted anymore, or whether he was simply delaying an unmasking he now dreaded, for reasons that had nothing to do with the original purpose of his disguise. Lord Ashford's presence at the house party had grown more pronounced in the days since his arrival, and Nathaniel noted, with the particular attentiveness of a man newly aware of his own jealousy, that Ashford had begun seeking out Clara's company with increasing frequency. He offered her his arm at every opportunity, complimented her at every meal, and seemed, to Nathaniel's watching eye, entirely convinced that his attentions would eventually be welcomed as they clearly were by other women at the gathering. Clara herself remained polite but unmoved, answering Ashford's compliments with pleasant brevity and finding reasons, again and again, to excuse herself from his company sooner than propriety strictly required. Nathaniel told himself this observation meant nothing, that a woman's coolness toward one suitor said nothing about her feelings toward a groom she believed beneath any romantic consideration entirely. But he found himself watching the exchanges nonetheless, unable to fully quiet the hope that had taken root somewhere in his chest during the storm. That afternoon, as he led a string of horses back from the eastern paddock, he passed close enough to the garden to hear Ashford's voice raised in mild irritation, and paused, out of sight behind the hedge, close enough to hear the exchange that followed. "You are difficult to read, Miss Whitmore," Ashford was saying, an edge of frustration beneath his practiced charm. "Most young women in your position would welcome a match such as I am offering. Your family's circumstances are not unknown to me." "I am aware of my family's circumstances better than anyone, my lord," Clara answered, her voice steady but cool. "I do not require you to remind me of them in order to secure my gratitude. I meant no offense." "Then I will assume none was intended," she said, though her tone suggested the offense had landed regardless of intention. "But I will not be rushed into gratitude I do not feel, whatever my family's circumstances may be." Nathaniel stood behind the hedge a moment longer, something fierce and unfamiliar rising in his chest at the thought of Ashford using her family's hardship as leverage in a courtship. He forced himself to continue on with the horses before either of them noticed him lingering, but the exchange stayed with him the rest of the day, another small piece of evidence in the growing case he had built, entirely without meaning to, that Clara Whitmore was exactly the woman he had hoped, against all his careful cynicism, to someday find. 2 mornings later, Clara appeared at the stable before dawn, well ahead of the rest of the household, dressed for riding, and asking quietly whether Nathaniel might saddle Bracken for an early ride, before the others woke. He agreed at once, though he knew a groom was not meant to accompany a lady guest so far from the house without express instruction from the head groom, and Elias, still asleep in his own quarters, had given no such instruction. "You needn't come with me," Clara said, noticing his hesitation as he led both Bracken and a second horse from the stalls. "I only wished for the quiet. I did not mean to trouble you at this hour." "It's no trouble," Nathaniel said, and found it was true. He wanted the quiet as much as she seemed to. Wanted an hour that belonged to neither the Duke's obligations nor the groom's disguise, only to the strange, unguarded space that had begun opening between them since the storm. They rode out across the eastern meadow as the sky lightened from gray to pale gold, saying little at first, content in the shared silence of early morning. Mist clung low over the grass, and Bracken moved through it easily, his earlier storm nerves entirely forgotten in the calm of the hour. "I come here when I need to think clearly," Clara said eventually, slowing her horse to a walk as they crested a low rise overlooking the house. "There is something about open ground that makes difficult thoughts easier to hold." "What thoughts are you holding this morning?" Nathaniel asked, and immediately wondered if the question overstepped the bounds of what a groom might reasonably ask. But Clara did not seem to mind the question. "Lord Ashford mostly," she admitted, with a faint, tired laugh. "He is not a cruel man, I think, only a thoughtless one, and thoughtless men can do as much harm as cruel ones without ever intending it. He believes he is offering me rescue, and cannot understand why I do not fall at his feet with gratitude. You do not care for him." "I do not know him well enough to care for him one way or another, and that is precisely my objection. He has decided the shape of our future together, without troubling to learn the shape of me first." She glanced sideways at Nathaniel, a small, considering look. "You, at least, have never once assumed you knew my mind before asking it." "I would not presume," Nathaniel said, and meant it more fully than she could have understood, given how much of his own mind remained hidden from her entirely. They rode on a while longer, the sun climbing higher, gilding the mist until it burned away entirely, and left the meadow bright and green beneath a clear sky. Clara spoke, in fragments, of her childhood before her father's death, of summers spent exactly on this land, when her family had still been welcome as equals rather than as objects of charitable memory, of a life that had once felt secure in ways it no longer did. "I do not tell most people these things," she said, as they turned the horses back toward the house. "It is easier to let them assume I am simply cheerful by nature, rather than explain that cheerfulness is sometimes a choice I make each morning, rather than a feeling that arrives on its own." "Why tell me then?" Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious, and a little unsteadied by the honor of her trust. Clara considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you have never once looked at me the way the others do, weighing what I am worth to know. You simply listen, as though the listening itself is enough of a reason." She smiled, somewhat rueful. "It is a rare quality, Nate, whoever taught it to you." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, guilt and tenderness tangling together in his chest in equal measure. He wanted, fiercely, to tell her the truth in that instant, to confess the name beneath the false one, and let her decide, with full knowledge, whether the man who had listened so carefully was worth her continued trust. But he held his tongue, telling himself the timing was wrong, that a confession delivered in the privacy of a meadow before breakfast would only confuse matters that deserved a clearer reckoning. It was, he knew even as he reasoned it through, a convenient excuse for cowardice, but he clung to it nonetheless, unwilling to risk the fragile, honest thing that had grown between them before he was ready to lose it. They reached the stable as the household was beginning to stir, and Clara dismounted with her usual quiet competence, handing Bracken's reins to Nathaniel with a smile that held no suspicion, no doubt, only simple gratitude for a morning well spent. "Thank you for the company," she said. "I did not realize how much I needed it until I had it." She left him standing in the yard, morning light spilling gold across the cobblestones, and Nathaniel watched her go with a growing certainty that he had crossed some threshold in the night just past, one that would demand, sooner rather than later, the very confession he had just talked himself out of making. Elias found him still standing there some minutes later, staring at the kitchen door long after it had closed behind her, and gave a low, knowing sound that was not quite a laugh. "You've got that look again," the head groom said, taking Bracken's lead from Nathaniel's slack hand. "The deciding look. Only now it seems you've gone and decided already, whether you meant to or not." "I don't know what you mean," Nathaniel said, though the denial carried little conviction even to his own ears. "No," Elias agreed, leading Bracken toward his stall. "I don't suppose you do. Not yet, but you will, and soon, unless I miss my guess entirely. These things have a way of demanding a reckoning, whether a man is ready to give one or not." He glanced back once, something almost sympathetic in his weathered face. "Whatever you're hiding, lad, and I've a suspicion it's more than a sore hand, I hope you find the courage to set it right before it costs you more than you're willing to pay." Nathaniel watched him disappear into the stable's cool shadow and stood alone in the brightening yard a long while, turning the warning over with the sober understanding that Elias, without knowing the full shape of the truth, had spoken it more plainly than Nathaniel had yet dared to admit even to himself. The trouble began 3 days later, on a bright afternoon when Lord Ashford, having failed to win Clara's favor through charm, decided to try a different approach entirely, one that Nathaniel would remember for a long time afterward, as the moment everything shifted beyond any hope of quiet resolution. The whole party had gathered for an afternoon of archery on the south lawn, targets set up at the edge of the meadow where the groom stood ready to manage the horses tethered nearby. Nathaniel had been assigned to hold the mounts, a task that kept him at the fringe of the gathering, close enough to watch but far enough to be, as always, unremarkable. Ashford had been drinking more than the occasion called for, his charm growing looser and his temper shorter with each passing hour, and when his final arrow missed the target entirely, sailing wide into the hedge, he rounded on the nearest groom in a fit of frustrated pride. The nearest groom happened to be Nathaniel. "You," Ashford snapped, striding toward him with the particular unsteadiness of a man who had drunk enough to feel bold and not enough to feel foolish. "You moved. I saw you shift behind the target line and put me off my aim." "I did not move, my lord," Nathaniel said evenly, though he had, in fact, stood perfectly still throughout the entire round. "Are you calling me a liar?" Ashford's voice rose, drawing the attention of the nearby guests, several of whom turned with the particular interest people reserve for a scene about to unfold. "I know what I saw. A groom who cannot hold still for a simple round of archery has no business standing so close to his betters." "I meant no disrespect," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice low and steady, though every instinct honed by 9 and 20 years as a duke screamed at him to answer the insult with the weight of his true rank. He could not without revealing everything, not without ending the disguise in the worst possible manner, in anger rather than honesty. Ashford stepped closer, close enough that Nathaniel could smell the wine on his breath. "Perhaps you need reminding of your place." A groom who cannot show proper respect to his betters is a groom who ought to be dismissed without a reference, and I would be glad to suggest as much to your employer." The threat landed with a particular sting Nathaniel had not expected, not because he feared dismissal, which could not truly touch him, but because he understood, in that moment, precisely how such words would land on a man who did not have a duke's title waiting beneath his borrowed coat. He understood, freshly and completely, the powerlessness Elias and the other hands lived with daily, the casual cruelty a man of rank could inflict without consequence, simply because he held the power to do so. He was still searching for a response that would not shatter his disguise when Clara stepped forward from the small crowd of onlookers, her face flushed not with embarrassment but with a controlled, quiet anger Nathaniel had not seen from her before. "Lord Ashford," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "I watched the entire round from where I stood, and I did not see this man move at all. Your arrow went wide because the wind shifted, as anyone paying proper attention would have noticed." Ashford turned to her, startled, his bluster faltering for a moment before pride reasserted itself. "Miss Whitmore, this is hardly your concern." "It is precisely my concern," Clara answered, "when I witness a guest threatening a man's livelihood over an excuse rather than a truth. If you wish to blame someone for a missed shot, my lord, I would suggest you look to the wine rather than to a groom who has done nothing but hold horses steady all afternoon." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the gathered guests, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to spare Ashford the humiliation of it. His face darkened, and for a moment Nathaniel feared the man's temper would turn from Nathaniel to Clara herself, but Ashford seemed to recognize, even through the wine, that further argument would only deepen his embarrassment before an audience already amused at his expense. "You are too quick to defend the help, Miss Whitmore," he said instead, his voice tight with wounded pride. "I would have thought a woman in your circumstances might show more caution about where she spends her sympathies." The remark was cruel in a way calculated to wound, invoking her family's reduced fortunes as though sympathy for a groom marked some further failing on her part, some inability to properly understand her own precarious social standing. Nathaniel felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, powerless in his disguise to answer the insult as he wished to. But Clara did not flinch. "My circumstances, my lord, have taught me a great deal about who deserves kindness and who does not. I find that lesson more valuable than anything my family's former fortune ever purchased." She turned, deliberately, from Ashford to Nathaniel, her expression softening entirely as she addressed him directly. "Are you well? He startled you badly, I think, more than he intended." Nathaniel understood, with a rush of feeling he struggled to contain, that she had just chosen to defend a groom's dignity over a lord's favor, in front of the entire assembled party, at real cost to her own social standing. Ashford was a man of consequence, a man whose good opinion mattered to a family in reduced circumstances hoping to maintain what connections it still possessed. She had risked that connection, publicly and without hesitation, because she believed the truth mattered more than the risk. "I am well," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." Ashford, sensing the moment had turned entirely against him, muttered something about fetching another quiver of arrows, and retreated toward the house, his humiliation trailing visibly behind him. The other guests began to disperse into smaller conversations, the drama already fading into the background hum of the afternoon, but Nathaniel remained rooted where he stood, watching Clara gather her composure and return to her place among the archers, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. To her, perhaps, nothing extraordinary had occurred. She had simply told the truth and defended a man being wronged, the same instinct that had made her thank a groom for a note 2 years past, the same instinct that had made her walk a muddy hill to spare a horse. But to Nathaniel, standing at the edge of the lawn with his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the confrontation itself, it felt like the final piece of evidence in a case he had stopped pretending, days ago, was truly about evidence at all. He loved her. He understood that now with a clarity that made every remaining hour of the disguise feel unbearable, a lie stretched thin over a truth that deserved better than deception. She had defended him at genuine cost to herself, not knowing he was a duke who could return the favor 1,000 times over, not knowing anything except that a man had been wronged in front of her, and that wronging him was something she could not stand by and watch happen. That evening, as the household settled and the last candles were extinguished in the great house's windows, Nathaniel climbed to his narrow cot above the tack room and lay awake long into the night, turning over the shape of the confession he now knew he could no longer delay. He could not continue watching her defend him without earning the right to stand beside her honestly. He could not let another day pass wearing a name that was not his own. not after what he had witnessed that afternoon. The question was no longer whether to reveal himself, but how, and whether any manner of revealing the truth could possibly soften the betrayal she would surely feel upon learning that the man she had defended, the man she had trusted with her private grief in a storm-lit stable, had been deceiving her from the very moment her carriage first arrived. He did not sleep that night. He lay listening to the horses shift below him, and the wind move through the eaves, and by the time gray dawn light finally crept through the narrow window, he had reached a decision he could not yet bring himself to feel entirely steady about, only certain, in the way a man is certain of a debt he can no longer avoid paying. What Nathaniel did not know, as he lay turning over the shape of his confession, was that Lord Ashford's humiliation on the archery lawn had not faded into simple embarrassment, as Nathaniel had assumed, but had curdled instead into a quiet, simmering resentment that sought an outlet. A man of Ashford's pride did not easily forgive being bested in front of an audience, least of all by a woman he had hoped to secure through the leverage of her family's misfortune, and least of all in defense of a servant. Ashford spent the following morning making careful, unhurried inquiries about the household, the sort of questions a guest might ask idly over breakfast without arousing suspicion. He asked the housekeeper how long the new groom had been in service. He asked a footman whether the Duke himself had personally hired the recent additions to the stable staff. He asked, with practiced casualness, whether it was true the Duke had been absent from his own house party for the better part of a week, and whether anyone found that absence the least bit unusual. The housekeeper, unaware of the danger in her honest answers, admitted that the new groom had appeared rather suddenly, without the usual references passed through proper channels, and that Elias Marsh himself had seemed puzzled by his arrival, though the man worked competently enough that no one had thought to question it further. She mentioned too, in the idle way servants sometimes share observations they do not realize carry weight, that the Duke's steward had grown oddly evasive whenever guests inquired after their host's return. Ashford turned these fragments over with the particular patience of a man nursing a grievance, and though he did not yet have the full shape of the truth, he began to suspect that something at Larchgate did not add up as cleanly as the household wished its guests to believe. It was, he decided, worth watching the mysterious groom a while longer, before deciding what to do with his suspicions. Nathaniel, unaware of Ashford's quiet investigation, spent that same morning searching for a private moment with Clara, uncertain exactly what he intended to say, but increasingly certain he could not let another full day pass without saying something. He found her in the kitchen garden again, seated on the same bench where she had once excused Ashford's temper, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the middle distance rather than the page. "You seem troubled," she said, glancing up as he approached, setting the book aside entirely. "I wanted to thank you," Nathaniel said, properly, "for what you did yesterday. It was not required of you, and it cost you something with Lord Ashford, I think." "It cost me nothing I valued keeping," Clara said, with a small, firm shake of her head. "I would rather lose Lord Ashford's good opinion 100 times over than stay silent while he bullied a man who could not answer him without losing his position." She studied Nathaniel's face for a long moment, something searching in her expression. "You looked as though you wished to answer him yourself, yesterday, as though the words were there, and only some great effort kept them from coming out." Nathaniel's chest tightened at how closely she had read him, closer than he had believed himself readable. "He was not the first man to speak to me as though I had no right to my own dignity," he said carefully, which was, in its strange way, entirely true, though the men who had spoken to him so had done so before he became a duke, in the brief years of his own boyhood before his father's title passed to him. "I have learned, over time, when to hold my tongue, and when the cost of speaking outweighs the satisfaction of it." "That sounds like a lonely kind of wisdom," Clara said softly. "It can be," Nathaniel admitted, and found, in that small, honest admission, a measure of relief that surprised him, the closest he had come yet to telling her something entirely true about himself, without the shelter of a groom's careful half-answers. They sat together a while longer in the quiet garden, and though neither spoke of it directly, Nathaniel felt the moment carrying weight beyond its ordinary conversation, a sense that whatever came next between them, whether ruin or something far better, was drawing steadily closer with each passing hour he continued to wear a name that was not his own. When Clara finally rose to return to the house, called by some obligation to the other guests, she paused a moment longer than necessary, looking back at him with an expression he could not quite name, equal parts curiosity, and something gentler, something that made his pulse quicken with hope he had no right to feel while the truth remained hidden between them. "I find myself glad, Nate, that you were the one holding the horses yesterday," she said, rather than someone who might not have stood so steady under the accusation. She smiled, small and genuine, and turned toward the house before he could find any answer worthy of the moment. Nathaniel watched her go, and stood alone in the garden a long while afterward, the sun climbing higher overhead, warming stone and soil alike, while he wrestled with the growing certainty that the confession he had been delaying could not wait much longer, whatever form it finally took, whatever it might cost him to speak it aloud. Lord Ashford found his answer 2 days later, and he found it, fittingly enough, through the very stable he had once threatened to have Nathaniel dismissed from. He had taken to walking the grounds in the early evening, ostensibly for air, though his true purpose was the continued nursing of his wounded pride and the slow gathering of whatever advantage he might find against the household that had humiliated him. It was during one such walk that he overheard Elias Marsh speaking to a delivery boy near the stable gate, discussing, in the unguarded way men speak when they believe themselves unobserved, the strange matter of the Duke's continued absence. "Steward says he'll be back within the week," Elias was saying, though he said the same for a week already. Odd business, a man vanishing from his own party like this, and that new groom appearing the very same day. No references, quiet as you please, working alongside the rest of us like he'd never held a title in his life. Elias laughed at his own turn of phrase, clearly meaning it as an idle joke rather than an accusation. But the words landed on Ashford's ears with an entirely different weight. Ashford stood very still behind the hedge, turning the pieces over with the sharp, ungenerous clarity of a man who had been searching for exactly this kind of leverage. A duke, vanished from his own house. A groom, appeared the very same day, speaking with a polish no ordinary stable hand possessed. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to build a suspicion worth testing, and Ashford was not a man inclined to let such a suspicion rest unconfirmed. He confirmed it that very night. In the crudest manner available to him, he waited until the household had largely retired, then made his way to the stable under the pretense of checking on his own horse, and found Nathaniel alone, finishing the evening's final rounds by lantern light. "A word, Groom," Ashford said, his voice carrying none of the drunken bluster of the archery lawn, replaced now with something colder and far more calculating. Nathaniel straightened, wary of the change in tone. "My lord." "I have been asking questions," Ashford said, circling slowly, "about a groom who speaks like a gentleman, who arrived the very day his duke went missing from his own party, who has, I understand, spent rather a great deal of private time with Miss Whitmore, for a man of his supposed station." He stopped, facing Nathaniel directly, a thin, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Shall I continue, or would you care to spare us both the trouble and confirm what I already suspect, your grace?" The title landed in the quiet stable like a struck bell, and Nathaniel felt the careful architecture of his disguise begin to crumble in an instant. Weeks of careful concealment, undone by one lord's wounded pride and idle gossip, overheard at the wrong moment. "You are mistaken," Nathaniel said, though the denial came too late and too weak to carry any real conviction, and Ashford's smile only widened at the confirmation written plainly across his face. "I am not mistaken, and we both know it." Ashford's voice hardened. "I wonder what Miss Whitmore will make of learning that the groom she defended so publicly, the groom she has apparently trusted with private conversations at all hours, is in truth the very duke whose good opinion her family so desperately needs. I wonder whether she will feel flattered by the deception, or whether she will feel, as I suspect any sensible woman would, entirely made a fool of. This is between myself and Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said, his voice low with a warning he could not fully mask even in his groom's plain speech. "It need not concern you further." "Ah, but it does concern me," Ashford said, "since you have made rather a point of undermining me in front of the entire party while hiding behind a false name. I think it only fair that everyone understand exactly what manner of game has been played at this house party, and by whom." He turned toward the door, clearly relishing the power he now held. "I believe I shall share what I know at breakfast tomorrow, your grace. It seems only right that the whole party should understand the truth before the week concludes." Nathaniel stood alone in the stable long after Ashford's footsteps had faded toward the house, the lantern light flickering over tack and straw, and felt the full weight of what was coming settle over him like a physical thing. He had wanted to confess the truth to Clara himself, gently, with time to explain his reasons and ask her forgiveness before the wider world learned of the deception. Ashford had stolen even that small mercy from him, and now the truth would arrive not as a careful confession, but as a public humiliation, delivered by a man who wished nothing but harm to both of them. He spent that night composing and abandoning a dozen different plans, each one collapsing under the weight of the same central problem. There was no way to soften what was coming. No way to arrive at Clara's door before breakfast without the conversation feeling exactly like what it was. A desperate, last-minute confession forced by circumstance rather than offered freely from honesty. He considered leaving before dawn, riding for the house's true entrance and returning as himself, arriving to intercept Ashford's announcement with the truth delivered in his own voice, rather than let the man corner Clara publicly with gossip. It was, he decided near dawn, the only option that preserved any dignity at all, for himself or for her. He rode out before first light, changing at his own house into clothes befitting his true station, and returned to Larchgate's front entrance as the sun climbed fully over the hills, presenting himself to his own startled steward, as the Duke finally returned from his fictional business in the north. Word spread through the house quickly, guests emerging from their rooms in various states of dress to greet their long-absent host, offering polite exclamations about his prolonged business, and expressing relief that he had finally returned to properly host his own gathering. Clara was among the last to appear at breakfast, and Nathaniel watched her enter the dining room from across the crowded table, watched the moment recognition crossed her face. Not immediate confusion, but something worse, a dawning, horrified understanding as she took in his face, his bearing, the unmistakable authority with which the other guests now addressed him. He saw the exact instant she understood. Her eyes widened, color draining from her face, and her gaze flew to the plain groom's coat still visible in memory beneath the fine clothes he now wore, piecing together weeks of conversation, of shared confidences, of a stormlit stable and a private grief about her father. All of it delivered to a man she had believed powerless, a man who had, in truth, held every advantage the entire time. "You," she said, so quietly that only those nearest could hear, though the single word carried more devastation than any louder accusation could have managed. "Clara," Nathaniel began, stepping toward her, but she had already stepped back, her hand rising as though to physically hold him at a distance. "Your Grace," she corrected, her voice now carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, cold in a way he had never heard from her before. "I believe that is the correct form of address, is it not? Though I confess I am somewhat uncertain of the proper etiquette for addressing a man who spent a fortnight deceiving me, while pretending to hold my confidences." Ashford, watching from across the room with poorly concealed satisfaction, said nothing, content to let the scene unfold without his interference. His earlier threat to expose the truth rendered unnecessary by Nathaniel's own preemptive confession. "I intended to tell you," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice low, aware of the audience surrounding them, but unwilling to let the conversation become entirely public spectacle if he could help it. "I came here this morning specifically to tell you myself, before anyone else could. How fortunate for you that your confession arrived just ahead of your exposure." Clara's voice shook now, grief and anger tangled together beneath the careful control she was visibly struggling to maintain. "Tell me, Your Grace, was it amusing, watching me speak so freely to a man I believed had nothing to gain from my honesty? Did you find it entertaining, collecting my confidences like a curiosity, knowing the whole time that I was making a fool of myself before a duke?" "It was never that," Nathaniel said, urgency creeping into his voice despite his effort to remain composed. "I came to Larchgate stables to test whether kindness could exist without an audience worth impressing. I did not expect to find you. I did not expect any of what followed. And yet you let it continue," Clara said. "Day after day, you let me believe I was speaking to a groom, let me defend you before the entire party, let me tell you things I have told no one else since my father died, and at no point did you consider that perhaps I deserved the truth before I gave you quite so much of myself." Her eyes glistened, though she held the tears back through evident force of will. "I do not know which wounds more, Your Grace, the deception itself, or the fact that I cannot now trust a single word you ever spoke to me, since I do not know which parts were the truth of a man, and which were merely the performance of a groom you invented for your own purposes." "Every word was true," Nathaniel said, desperate now, aware of how thoroughly he was losing ground with each passing moment. "The name was false, nothing else was." But Clara had already turned away, her composure cracking at last as she hurried from the dining room, leaving behind a silence so complete that Nathaniel could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. He moved to follow her, but Elias Marsh, present among the household staff called to attend the returned Duke, caught his sleeve with a firm hand. "Let her go, Your Grace," Elias said quietly, the familiar gruffness in his voice now tempered with something almost sympathetic, though his eyes carried clear disappointment as he studied the man he had shared bread with only days before. "Chasing her now, in front of this crowd, will only make it worse. Give her room to breathe before you try to make it right." Nathaniel stood frozen in the doorway, watching the space where Clara had disappeared, and understood, with a sinking certainty that settled deep in his chest, that he had lost something in that single morning that might take far longer than a fortnight to win back, if it could be won back at all. The remainder of the day passed in a strange, uncomfortable fashion, the household attempting to resume its ordinary rhythms, while the entire party privately buzzed with the scandal of a duke discovered in disguise. Guests offered Nathaniel careful, curious glances over luncheon, unsure whether to treat the matter as scandal or romance, and Lord Ashford, having achieved his revenge, seemed content to let the gossip spread on its own without further stoking it, though the satisfied set of his mouth whenever Nathaniel's name arose told its own story. Clara did not appear again that day. Her mother, Nathaniel learned through careful, quiet inquiry, had taken a tray to her room, citing a headache that fooled no one among the staff who had witnessed the morning's confrontation. Nathaniel considered, and discarded, a dozen approaches. A note slipped beneath her door, a request through her mother for a private audience, a public apology before the assembled guests that might restore some measure of her dignity, even if it could not restore her trust. Each option felt, upon reflection, more likely to compound the injury than heal it. He sought out Elias again that evening, finding the old groom in the stable yard, tending the same horses Nathaniel had cared for only that morning as a false hand rather than a true master. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said, standing awkwardly in his fine clothes among the stalls that had, for a brief while, felt more like home than his own grand house ever had. "I deceived you along with everyone else." Elias considered him for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable. "You worked an honest shift, Your Grace, whatever name you gave it under. I've no complaint about the labor." He paused, testing the weight of his next words. "But I'll admit I'm troubled by the manner of it. All the same, you watched us, these past days, judging who among us deserved your good opinion, while we had no notion we were being judged at all. There's something uneven in that, even setting aside the girl entirely." The observation struck Nathaniel harder than he expected, cutting closer to an uncomfortable truth he had not fully examined until Elias spoke it aloud. He had come to Larchgate stables to judge Clara's character, confident in his own right to conduct such a test, without ever pausing to consider whether the judging itself carried its own kind of arrogance, a duke deciding, from his position of total advantage, who among the powerless deserved his trust. "You're right," Nathaniel admitted quietly. "I did not consider it from that angle until just now. Most men in your position never do," Elias said, though not unkindly. "It's easier to see the unfairness of a thing when you're the one standing in the mud, rather than the one deciding who gets to climb out of it." He returned to his work, brushing down a tired mare with steady, practiced strokes. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I don't think less of you for the disguise itself, only for how long you let it run, and what it cost her in the end, to learn the truth in front of a room full of strangers rather than from you alone, in private, when there was still time to soften the blow." Nathaniel carried those words with him back to the house, turning them over long into the evening, and found in them a clearer understanding of his own failure than any amount of private brooding had managed to produce on its own. He had told himself, throughout the fortnight, that he was delaying his confession out of caution, out of a desire to be certain before he risked everything on a declaration. But the truth, he now recognized, was simpler and less flattering. He had delayed because the disguise had become comfortable, because he had enjoyed being loved for himself rather than his title, and he had clung to that comfort a full week longer than honesty should have permitted, leaving Clara to discover the deception in the worst possible manner, rather than hearing it gently from the one person who owed her better. He wrote a letter that night, several drafts discarded before he settled on words simple enough to carry the weight of a genuine apology, without the polish of a practiced courtier's excuse. He did not send it immediately. He understood, from Elias's counsel and his own better judgment, that Clara needed time before any words from him, however honest, would land as anything other than further intrusion. He set the letter aside, unsent, and resolved to wait, however difficult the waiting proved to be, until some sign suggested she might be willing to hear him at all. The following morning brought word, delivered quietly by Clara's mother to the Duke's steward, that the Whitmore family intended to depart Larchgate a full 3 days ahead of the party's planned conclusion, citing a sudden need to attend to matters at home. Nathaniel understood the message clearly enough beneath its polite phrasing. Clara did not wish to remain under his roof a moment longer than necessary, and no amount of hoping on his part would change that fact before the carriage wheels began turning toward the road. He stood at his own front steps the morning of her departure, watching from a discreet distance as the same small, rattling carriage that had first brought her to Larchgate now prepared to carry her away from it, Bracken saddled and tethered behind for the journey home. Clara emerged from the house with her mother, her face composed into careful neutrality, and though her eyes swept briefly across the courtyard, they did not settle on Nathaniel at all, moving past him as though he occupied no more significance than the gravel beneath her feet. He did not approach her. He had promised himself, and Elias in spirit if not in word, that he would give her the space she needed, rather than compound his earlier trespass with a public plea she had not invited. He watched the carriage pull away down the long drive, watched it grow smaller against the green hills, until it disappeared entirely around the bend toward the main road, and felt, standing there in the morning light that had once seemed so full of promise, that he had allowed the truest thing in his life to slip away through his own cowardice, dressed up, however carefully, as caution. 3 weeks passed before Nathaniel allowed himself to act on the letter he had written and set aside, and in that time he did not sit idle, waiting for grief to soften into forgiveness on its own. He spent the weeks instead in a kind of quiet reckoning, examining not only the fortnight of his disguise, but the whole shape of the life that had led him to conduct such a test in the first place. He visited Elias Marsh often during those weeks, no longer disguised, seeking the old groom's blunt counsel on matters he had never before thought to ask a servant's opinion about. He began, too, a slower and more searching change in how he moved through his own household, taking time to learn the names of staff he had walked past for years without truly seeing, listening when they spoke, rather than simply hearing the sound of service performed correctly. It was not a grand transformation, nothing so tidy as a single moment of revelation, but a gradual unlearning of habits he had absorbed since childhood without ever questioning them. He also during those weeks made careful and discreet inquiries into the Whitmore family's circumstances, learning through channels that did not trace back to himself that Clara's family occupied a modest house some 20 miles from Larchgate, their finances strained but not yet desperate, sustained by the careful economy Clara herself had described in the storm-lit stable that now felt, to Nathaniel, like a lifetime ago. He did not send money. He understood, even in his eagerness to help, that such a gesture would only compound the very insult Ashford had already inflicted, treating her family's hardship as a lever to pull rather than a private matter deserving of dignity. Instead, he waited, and thought, and eventually arrived at a plan that felt less like a duke correcting an error and more like a man trying, honestly, to become worthy of a second chance he had not yet earned. He rode to the Whitmore house himself, unannounced, dressed neither as the groom he had pretended to be nor in the full formal dress of his rank, but simply as a man calling on another man's daughter with an apology he owed and no guarantee it would be received. Clara's mother answered the door herself, the household evidently too modest to keep extensive staff, and her expression upon recognizing him carried a complicated mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been cautious hope. "Your Grace," she said, "I confess I did not expect you. I would not blame your daughter for refusing to see me," Nathaniel said, "but I hoped you might allow me a few moments to explain myself, if not to her, then at least to you, so that whatever she decides with the full truth before her, rather than only the worst of it." Mrs. Whitmore studied him a long moment before stepping aside to let him enter, leading him to a small, comfortably worn parlor, where the marks of reduced fortune were visible, but not shameful, a household managing its circumstances with quiet dignity rather than desperate display. "She is in the garden," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I will not force her to see you, Your Grace, but I will tell her you have called, and she may decide for herself." Nathaniel waited in the small parlor with a patience that cost him considerable effort, uncertain whether the minutes stretching past meant Clara was gathering courage to face him, or gathering resolve to refuse him entirely. When she finally appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded but no longer carrying the raw devastation he had last seen at Larchgate's breakfast table, he rose immediately, uncertain of the proper etiquette for a moment that etiquette had never quite prepared him to navigate. "You came a long way, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice cool but steady. "For a conversation you could have concluded far more easily by simply staying away." "I considered staying away," Nathaniel admitted. "I decided it was the coward's choice, and I have made enough cowardly choices where you are concerned. I owed you this much at least, whatever you decide once I have said it." Clara did not sit, and did not invite him to, but she did not leave the doorway either, which Nathaniel chose to interpret as permission enough to continue. "I came to Larchgate stables because I had grown tired of being valued for my title rather than myself," he said. "I told myself I was testing the women at that party, judging whether any among them could treat a servant with the same regard they showed a duke. It was, I have since come to understand, a deeply unfair test, conducted entirely on my own terms, with all the power resting in my hands and none in yours. I watched you, and judged you, while you believed yourself simply living honestly, with no notion that your honesty was being weighed and measured for my private satisfaction. You understand that at least, Clara said, something in her posture easing very slightly. I have had 3 weeks to understand a great many things I ought to have understood far sooner, Nathaniel said. I understand that I should have told you the truth long before Lord Ashford forced my hand. I understand that even my reasons for the disguise, however well-intentioned, gave me no right to collect your private grief about your father, your fears about your family's circumstances, your trust in a man you believed had nothing to gain from earning it, without eventually giving you the same honesty in return. I took far more than I offered, and I am sorry for it, more sorry than I know how to properly say. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her arms crossed loosely, her eyes searching his face with the same careful attention she had once given a nervous horse during a storm. Why did you not simply reveal yourself the moment you understood I would not treat the truth unkindly? You must have known, well before the archery lawn, that I was not the sort of woman who would think less of a groom for being a groom. I knew it, Nathaniel admitted. I think that is precisely why I delayed. I had never before been loved, or even liked, without my title attached to the affection. I did not want to risk losing that, even for the sake of honesty. And so I told myself excuses about timing and caution, while the truer reason was simply that I was afraid. He held her gaze steadily, though the admission cost him considerable pride. It was selfish, and it cost you dearly, and I have no defense for it beyond the truth of why it happened. Something shifted in Clara's expression, the guardedness softening into something more thoughtful, though not yet forgiving. You hurt me badly, Your Grace. Not merely by the deception itself, but by what it made me question afterward. I have spent 3 weeks wondering whether every kind word you spoke to me was calculated, whether my grief over my father was simply useful material for your judgment, whether the man who sat with me during that storm was ever real at all, or only a performance clever enough to fool a foolish, lonely woman. You were never foolish, Nathaniel said, urgency creeping into his voice, and nothing I said to you was performance. The name was false. The man beneath it was entirely real. More real with you, I think, than I have been with anyone in years, precisely because you did not know to treat me carefully, as something requiring flattery and management. You treated me as a person, and I have not stopped thinking, since that morning at Larchgate, about what it cost you to give me that, and what it will take to earn the right to receive it honestly. Clara looked away, toward the garden window where afternoon light fell soft across worn furniture, and was quiet long enough that Nathaniel feared he had said everything he could, and it had still not been enough. I do not know if I can simply set aside what happened, she said finally, turning back to him. I do not think trust rebuilds itself in a single afternoon, however sincere the apology. I am not asking for a single afternoon, Nathaniel said. I am asking for the chance to earn it back properly, over however long it takes, without any further deception standing between us. I will not pretend to be anything other than exactly what I am, from this moment forward, whatever that costs either of us. Clara studied him a while longer, and Nathaniel forced himself to bear the silence without filling it, understanding that whatever she decided deserved to be decided at her own pace, not rushed by his own eagerness for resolution. You may call again, she said at last, if you wish. Not tomorrow, and not with any expectation of a particular welcome, but you may call, and we will see, in time, whether the man I met in that stable and the Duke standing before me now are truly the same person, or whether I only imagined the parts of him worth keeping. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left open rather than closed entirely, and Nathaniel accepted it with more gratitude than a grander promise might have earned from him a month before. He called again the following week, and the week after that, each visit conducted with careful patience, no grand declarations, only honest conversation, the same kind he had once offered her in a stable while wearing a groom's plain coat. He told her gradually true stories of his childhood, his father's cold calculations regarding marriage, the loneliness of a life spent uncertain whether any affection offered him was genuine. She told him, in turn, more of her father, of the family's slow decline, of the particular exhaustion of maintaining cheerful dignity before people who pitied her. Elias Marsh, when Nathaniel visited Larchgate's stables during those months, offered occasional gruff commentary on the courtship's progress, approving in his own understated fashion of the slow, patient manner in which his former fellow groom now pursued the woman he had once merely observed. It was nearly 4 months after that first difficult conversation in the Whitmore parlor that Nathaniel returned once more, this time with a small velvet box he had carried for a week without finding the courage to present it, uncertain whether enough trust had been rebuilt to bear the weight of such a question. He found Clara in the garden, as he so often did now, and she looked up at his approach with an easy warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that first devastating morning at Larchgate. "You look nervous," she observed, setting aside the book she had been reading. "I find I still am. Occasionally, even after all these months," Nathaniel admitted, and knelt beside her bench, the small box suddenly heavy in his hand. "I have spent a great deal of time considering how to ask you this properly, and I find, in the end, that I have no cleverer words than the ones I offered you that first night in the storm. I love you, Clara, not the version of you that might have existed had circumstances been kinder, but exactly the woman you are, who treats grooms and dukes with the same honest regard, who defended a stranger's dignity at real cost to her own, who taught me, without ever intending to, what it means to be valued for something more than a title." Clara's eyes glistened, though she did not look away this time, meeting his gaze steadily as he opened the small box between them. "I am asking you to marry me," Nathaniel said, "not as a duke offering rescue to a family in reduced circumstances, and not as a groom with nothing to offer but honest affection, but simply as Nathaniel, the man beneath both those names, who has spent months learning to deserve the trust you gave so freely, before you had any reason to believe it would be honored." Clara reached for his hand, holding it steady rather than reaching immediately for the ring, her expression thoughtful even through the visible emotion. "You understand that I do not need rescuing," she said. "My family has managed, and will continue to manage, whatever you decide." "I understand that entirely," Nathaniel said. "I am not offering rescue, I am offering myself, whatever that is worth to you, title and all its complications included, because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life with anyone who did not first love the version of me that had nothing to offer but honest labor and quiet company." Clara smiled then, fully, the same warm, unguarded smile she had once given a stranger holding her horse's reins in a muddy stable yard, and Nathaniel understood, watching it, that whatever damage the deception had caused had finally, truly healed into something stronger for having survived the mending. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you, Nathaniel, groom or duke or whatever name you choose to wear, so long as you promise never again to make me guess which one I am speaking to." He promised, and meant it fully, and slipped the ring onto her hand in the quiet garden where so much of their slow rebuilding had taken place, and if the servants watching from the house's windows found the sight of a duke kneeling before a modest gentlewoman's garden bench somewhat unusual, none of them thought it anything less than exactly right. Given everything the household staff at Larchgate had quietly come to understand about the character of the woman who had, in the end, judged a disguised duke far more fairly than he had ever judged himself. The wedding took place at Larchgate in early autumn, when the meadows had turned gold and the air carried the first crisp edge of the coming season. Clara insisted, against the protests of several distant relations who felt such matters ought to remain strictly separate, that Elias Marsh and the full stable staff be seated among the invited guests rather than relegated to serving the occasion from its edges, and Nathaniel supported her insistence without a moment's hesitation, understanding exactly why the request mattered to her as much as it now mattered to him. Elias, uncomfortable in a borrowed coat far finer than anything he owned, sat through the ceremony with visible discomfort at the attention, though he could not quite suppress a proud, gruff smile when the vows were finally spoken, muttering afterward to anyone within earshot that he had known, from that very first week, that the new groom had the look of a man deciding something important, though he confessed he had not guessed quite how far that decision would eventually carry. Bracken, groomed to a fine shine for the occasion, stood tethered near the garden where the small wedding breakfast was held afterward, and Clara made a point of visiting him before the meal properly began, resting her forehead against his neck for a quiet moment, the way she had done on so many mornings before, murmuring words of gratitude to the last living piece of her father's memory, now present to witness the beginning of her new life. Lord Ashford was not among the guests, having quietly withdrawn from society's notice in the months following his failed courtship and petty revenge, his reputation having suffered rather more from his own vindictive behavior than from any retaliation Nathaniel might have considered and ultimately chosen not to pursue. Nathaniel found, examining his own feelings on the matter, that he held no particular satisfaction in Ashford's diminished standing, only a quiet relief that the man's cruelty had not, in the end, succeeded in poisoning the thing it had been aimed at destroying. Clara's mother wept openly through the ceremony, though whether from grief for her late husband's absence or joy at her daughter's happiness, or some tangled combination of both, Nathaniel did not presume to guess, only offered her his arm afterward with the same quiet respect he now extended to every member of the household, staff and family alike, a habit that had become, over the months of his courtship, less a deliberate practice and more simply the man he had grown into. As the wedding breakfast wound toward evening and the guests began their slow departures down the long drive, Nathaniel found a quiet moment alone with Clara at the edge of the garden, the autumn light turning soft and amber around them, and thought back, as he often still did, to the muddy afternoon her small carriage had first rattled up that same drive, and the strange, quiet impulse that had made him stop and truly look at her, rather than glance past her as he had glanced past 19 other guests that same day. "I still think of that first afternoon," he admitted, watching the last of the carriages disappear around the bend. "I nearly did not notice you at all. You arrived so quietly, after all the grander entrances had already passed." "I have never needed a grand entrance," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over months of careful rebuilding. "I only ever needed someone willing to look closely enough to notice what was actually there." "I am glad, every day, that I looked," Nathaniel said, and meant it more fully than any vow he had spoken earlier that afternoon, understanding at last that the disguise which had begun as a test of her character had become, in the end, the truest gift he had ever given himself, the chance to be loved not for the title he carried, but for the man he had slowly, honestly, become worthy of being. A year into their marriage, Nathaniel found himself facing a decision he had not anticipated when he first exchanged vows in the golden autumn light of Larchgate's garden, one that would test whether the lessons of his disguise had truly changed him, or merely softened him for a season, before old habits reasserted themselves. The estate's tenant farms had suffered a difficult harvest, the wheat thinner than expected after a wet spring, and Nathaniel's steward brought him the usual proposal offered in such years, a modest reduction in the tenant's obligations, calculated carefully to protect the estate's own finances while offering just enough relief to prevent open hardship. It was the proposal his father would have approved without hesitation, reasonable by the standards of their class, generous by the standards most landowners practiced. Nathaniel found himself, reading the figures, thinking not of the estate's ledgers but of Elias Marsh, sharing bread quietly with a stranger he believed simply another working man, of Clara wringing rainwater from her sleeve rather than let a horse suffer unnecessary strain. He thought of the particular, grinding anxiety he had witnessed in the stable yard during his weeks of disguise, the quiet calculations working men made about whether their labor would stretch far enough to cover the coming winter. He brought the matter to Clara that evening, laying out both his steward's proposal and his own uncertain instinct that it did not go far enough, and found in her not simply agreement but a sharper, more practical wisdom, born of her own family's hardship, insight into exactly which obligations might be reduced without endangering the estate's own stability, and which relief would matter most to families facing the leanest months. "You are asking the right question," she told him, studying the ledger with the same careful attention she had once given a nervous horse during a storm. "But you are asking it from too great a distance. Send for a few of the tenant families directly, and ask them plainly what would help most. I promise you, they will know far better than any steward's calculations what their own hardship requires." Nathaniel followed her counsel, an unusual practice for a man of his rank, and found the resulting conversations more illuminating than any ledger could have offered. Tenant farmers speaking plainly of specific burdens, a roof needing repair before winter, a debt owed to a merchant in the nearest town, concerns that no steward's general formula could have properly addressed. He adjusted the estate's approach accordingly, tailoring relief to actual need rather than uniform calculation, and found the practice, once begun, difficult to abandon in subsequent years, a habit of direct attention that Clara had taught him as surely as she had once taught a grieving horse to settle during a storm. Elias Marsh, still head groom at Larchgate though now graying further at the temples, watched these changes unfold with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spoken plainly to his duke once, in a stable yard, and lived to see the words take root. He remained blunt with Nathaniel in a manner few other members of the household dared, a privilege Nathaniel had explicitly encouraged rather than merely tolerated, understanding by then how rare and valuable honest counsel truly was for a man surrounded, by nature of his position, with people inclined to agreement rather than truth. "You've grown into the coat properly now," Elias told him one autumn morning, watching Nathaniel help a young stable hand untangle a particularly stubborn knot in a lead rope, a task well beneath a duke's expected attention, that Nathaniel had simply undertaken, because he happened to be present, and the hand happened to need an extra set of steady fingers. "Took you long enough, mind. But you got there." "I had a good teacher," Nathaniel said, glancing toward the house where Clara could be seen through a window, seated with the household accounts she had, over the past year, taken an increasing and welcomed hand in managing, her practical eye for genuine need proving as valuable to Larchgate's affairs as it had once proven in a stable yard during a storm. Clara herself had settled into her role at Larchgate with a quiet confidence that surprised even those who had known her longest, extending to the wider household the same consistent warmth she had once shown a groom she believed powerless to reward her for it. The younger housemaids in particular had come to regard her with an affection bordering on devotion, finding in their new duchess a woman who remembered their names, asked after their families, and treated their concerns with the same seriousness she extended to matters of estate business. She had not forgotten the lessons of her own hardship either, and made a point, each year, of ensuring that girls in situations resembling her own family's fallen circumstances, families of good standing brought low by misfortune rather than fault, received invitations and consideration that pure social calculation might have overlooked. It was, she told Nathaniel once, her own quiet correction to a system that had taught her, during her leanest years, exactly how easily kindness could be withheld from those who no longer had visible wealth to justify it. Bracken lived out his remaining years in comfortable retirement in Larchgate's finest paddock, no longer required for travel or labor, simply permitted to graze the good grass and enjoy Clara's frequent visits, her hand still finding his neck in the same slow, steady strokes she had used to calm him during that first great storm. When age finally caught up with him, some 3 years into the marriage, Clara grieved him properly, without shame or apology for tears shed over a horse, and Nathaniel sat with her through the grief, exactly as he had once sat with her through thunder in a lantern-lit stable, understanding by then that some griefs did not require solving, only accompanying. Lord Ashford, in the years that followed, made no further appearance in their lives beyond the occasional distant mention in society gossip, his reputation never fully recovering from the pettiness of his revenge, though Nathaniel found, examining his own feelings on the matter from the settled comfort of a genuinely happy marriage, that he bore the man remarkably little lasting resentment. Ashford had, in his own clumsy and unintended way, forced a reckoning that Nathaniel's own caution might have delayed indefinitely, and though the manner of the exposure had cost both Nathaniel and Clara real pain, the marriage that followed had grown, if anything, stronger for having survived the difficult honesty that pain demanded. Nathaniel found himself, in quieter moments, still returning to that first muddy afternoon, watching a small, rattling carriage arrive last among 20 grander ones, watching a woman descend and lead her own horse rather than wait for assistance, watching her stop and truly look at a groom that 19 other guests had glanced past without a second thought. He had come to Larchgate's own stables seeking proof that kindness could exist without an audience worth impressing, and he had found, in the end, something far greater than proof, a woman whose character remained exactly as steady and true whether observed by a duke, a groom, or no one at all, and a marriage built not on the shifting sands of title and fortune, but on the far sturdier ground of honesty finally, fully offered between two people who had each, in their own difficult way, learned precisely what it cost to withhold it. Their first child, a daughter born the following spring, arrived on a morning bright with sunshine after a night of gentle rain, and Clara insisted, over the mild protests of the attending physician, that Elias Marsh be among the first outside the family permitted to see the newest member of the household, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the kind of household she and Nathaniel intended to build together, one where rank mattered a great deal less than the steady, quiet character a person carried within it. They named her Margaret, after Clara's grandmother, and as Nathaniel held his daughter for the first time, standing in the same bright nursery window that overlooked the stable yard where his own transformation had begun years before, he found himself hoping, above every other wish a new father might carry, that she would grow to judge people not by the coats they wore or the titles attached to their names, but by the same patient, honest attention her mother had once given a stranger holding a horse's reins in the mud, back when neither of them had known what that small kindness would eventually grow into. Clara recovered from the birth with the same steady resolve she brought to everything else in her life, and within a few weeks had resumed her quiet involvement in the estate's affairs. Little Margaret often carried along in a basket while her mother reviewed accounts or spoke with tenant families about the coming season. The household staff, who had grown genuinely fond of their duchess over the preceding years, doted on the child with an affection that had nothing performed about it, and Nathaniel often found the nursery crowded with visitors from every corner of the household, from the housekeeper to the stable hands, all eager for a glimpse of the newest vein. Elias Marsh, gruff as ever, proved an unexpectedly gentle presence around the child, teaching her, Once she was old enough to toddle unsteadily across the stable yard, the proper way to approach a horse without startling it. The same patient lessons he had once given a disguised duke learning to muck out stalls. Margaret grew up knowing the stable as well as she knew the great house itself, comfortable equally among grooms and guests, a small reflection of the values her parents had worked so deliberately to build into their household. Nathaniel, in the years that followed, found himself returning occasionally to the practice that had begun his transformation, though never again through outright deception. He made a habit of walking the estate's grounds unannounced, speaking directly with tenants and staff rather than relying solely on his steward's reports, a practice that earned him, over time, a reputation among neighboring landowners as an unusually attentive master, one whose tenants rarely suffered the quiet hardships that went unnoticed on estates run purely through ledgers and distance. He told Margaret the story of the disguise when she was old enough to understand it properly, seated together in the same garden where he had once knelt before her mother with a small velvet box, and watched his daughter's face move through surprise, amusement, and finally a thoughtful seriousness that reminded him powerfully of Clara at her most reflective. "Would you do it again?" Margaret asked him once, knowing how much it hurt her, in the end. Nathaniel considered the question with the honesty he had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to bring to every important matter in his life. "I would find a better way to arrive at the same truth," he told her. "The test itself was not wrong, I think, wanting to know a person's character before trusting it with everything I had to offer. But the manner of it cost your mother more than it should have, and I have spent every year since trying to make certain the honesty between us never again depends on anything but plain, ordinary truth, spoken freely rather than uncovered by accident." He smiled, watching Clara approach across the lawn, older now but carrying the same unhurried grace she had shown that first muddy afternoon so many years before. "It is a lesson I hope you carry more easily than I did, should you ever find yourself wondering whether someone's kindness is real or merely performed for advantage. Watch how they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. That is where the truth of a person always shows itself most clearly, whether they know they are being watched or not." Clara joined them on the garden bench as the afternoon light softened toward evening, and the three of them sat together a while longer. The same quiet, patient warmth that had first drawn a lonely duke to a modest gentlewoman now settled comfortably into the whole shape of the family they had built together, honest at last in every particular that mattered.